Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, November 2nd, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the numbers that have been released this morning from NBC News showing Democrats with quite a substantial lead over Republicans in their new generic ballot poll as we look ahead to the November 2026 midterm elections. Donald Trump and the White House are in an immensely unpopular situation as voters give Donald Trump a record low approval rating as they simultaneously expect to cast their ballots in a year's time in favor of the Democratic Party in a massive way. And these numbers here rank in as the largest generic ballot poll lead that NBC News has found not just for the Democratic Party, but any singular political party dating back to the 2018 midterm elections, which were midterm elections that Democrats would arguably love to replicate in the 2026 cycle. And that's because in 2018, despite the odds of the 2016 election map being overwhelmingly conservative, Republicans had 241 seats in the House of Representatives. In 2018, the Democrats went from 194 all the way up to 235, gaining 40 seats across the country. A pretty notable amount, and one that really helped declare and define the 2018 midterm year as a Democratic wave year entirely. Looking at a lot of these districts, looking at the swing that we saw from 2016 to 2018, it was quite substantial. And with it came an exceptional popular vote victory, one that in 2016, which we saw the Republicans win that popular vote margin across the country, roughly here 48.3 to 47.3 by roughly 1 point. In 2018, it was the Democrats who dominated on the national level, winning by nearly 10 points across the board here, being up by roughly 8 against the Republicans in a head-to-head here in quite a substantial way. You'll really actually find here that the margin breakdown, does lend itself to showing not just a Democratic wave year, but arguably what many people saw as a Democratic tsunami. And so thinking about 2026, the Democrats have been lagging behind in the generic ballot poll. NBC News now ranks in, however, as the second mainstream pollster to show the Democrats in a great position for the 2026 midterms. Quinnipiac University, who has been spot on a year out from the midterm cycle in the past 3 cycles, found that in October of 2025, it's now November, so roughly a week ago, they found that it was the Democrats who led the Republicans on the national level by a pretty significant amount. You were talking roughly 9 points in that generic ballot across the country here, and I do think that is one. Ultimately, that says that voters were fed up with the Republicans, are fed up with what Donald Trump is doing, and want to elect Democrats in response. And so now that NBC News is pretty much confirming that across the board here, showing that Democrats are up by, again, 8 points nationally, again, comes into the fact that Donald Trump is down by roughly 12 on the national stage, just a 43% approval rating across the country as Democrats ring in at 50% in terms of Democratic control. And a big thing here that is really quite interesting is that when it comes down to probably one of the most pressing issues in the minds of a lot of American voters today, especially those who are inclined to vote in a midterm election, higher propensity voters who are excited and in some cases angered enough to turn out in a midterm cycle, 52% of the American public blames Trump and or congressional Republicans for the government shutdown. That's in contrast with 42% for the Democrats. So by a 10-point margin, the country blames Republicans more for the shutdown than the Democrats. I mean, this is something that really should be breaking down bipartisan control. It should be breaking down in the way that if the Republican numbers were the exact same from the last presidential cycle, should be breaking down with Republicans, taking less of the blame than Democrats if the country was in fact in favor of Republicans more than Democrats. But obviously, that is not the case. The data here also tells us that when it comes down to the approval rating of the Democratic Party nationwide, just 28% of the country has a positive view of the Democratic Party, just 28%. Republicans are a bit higher at roughly 36%, but the reason why that matters is because Republicans have been running with these talking points that because Democrats are in a low point in terms of national approval, very much so, that means that Democrats would not get any votes. But as the approval rating rings it at 28%, nearly double the amount of people that approve of the Democratic Party together are the amount of voters that are willing to elect Democrats in the next cycle. And again, it makes sense, right? Voters are largely discontent with what they are seeing in Washington, D.C., whether that's the government shutdown, whether that's the tariffs that we're seeing ravage across this country, damaging our economy to a record low position. You are finding The American public has far more reasons to be fed up with Donald Trump in the White House, and they are expressing it not just as a means of saying, I disapprove of the job that Donald Trump is doing, which is what we actually saw in an earlier poll done by NBC News. We can find back in March, they conducted a very similar survey where Democrats only led nationally by roughly 1 point. But the challenges existed, right? Voters started to sour on Donald Trump. His approval rating went from being plus 12 on Inauguration Day to being down by 4 in the middle of March. And that's actually the exact convergence point where we saw that Donald Trump's approval rating really took a turn for the worst. You'll find, unfortunately, we can't see the visualization here as easily, but you'll see that it was around this point where the approve margin was roughly above the disapprove. And right around March, 13th, was when Donald Trump's approval rating went into the negative. NBC releases a new poll showing that, Donald Trump's approval rating's in the negative for the first time in their survey. And Democrats are only translating that to roughly a 1-point advantage when it comes down to the generic ballot. Roughly a 1-point advantage in that first NBC News poll. But as we know, the numbers started to get better for the Democratic Party. No NBC News polls between now and then, but it shows a massive, massive change in support. Democrats go from being up by 1 to now up by 8, and it rings in as the second quality pollster that shows Democrats in a strong enough position to say that 2026 will more likely than not be not just a good year for the Democrats, but arguably a Democratic wave. And so seeing what that actually would translate to on the national level, I think we can visually see. If you were to take a look, at the 2016 election and swing a lot of these districts, you're going to find that we'll compare 2016 and 2018 after this. Actually, let's do it afterwards because I think that could be a little bit better of a visualization. But this is the 2024 election. Republicans won on the national popular vote against the Democrats by roughly here 2.6%. So if Democrats were, in fact, going to be up by 8 on Election Day, exactly as, this poll is predicting, obviously it's no guarantee, but let's assume that it happens for the sake of, exploring it here. You would shift the entire election in the map here by roughly 10.6%. After all, 2.6 plus 8 equals 10.6%. The Democratic Party minority of 215 seats would skyrocket up to 241 seats on the national level, 6 seats more than what the Republicans got in 2018. So keeping that in mind, 241, well, actually, just go ahead and compare it. We'll go back and forth here so we can take a look. Let's go back and take a look at the 2016 election. Remember, Republicans won this popular vote by roughly 1 point, but in the actual 2018 cycle, we actually saw that neither party really got a majority. It was the Democrats who got to that majority point in 2018. But 53.4% minus 44.8% is roughly 8.6%. So you're talking about a 9.6% difference off the 2016 cycle, and so we can do that. We can actually shift it here, a 9.6% margin shift in favor of the Democratic Party, and you'll see a House map here that actually is not so good for the Democrats. It really doesn't do that much, in favor of their political party. It doesn't really change that much about the race here between 2016 to 2018. And you have to think, okay, so then how did the Democrats actually get to the point where they were actually winning? Well, you'd have to shift, let's go, 9 or 9.6% again and see where it brings the Democrats. Sure, you find it there. But comparing it to the 2016 cycle, Democrats actually did far better than just what the universal shift was. The map here is so lopsided and so gerrymandered that the Democratic Party's numbers from 194 sure improve. But again, that 9.6% shift isn't doing much for them across the board. It didn't translate to what the 2018 style victory did in the same way that today, if you were to take that change, Democrats would be in a far better position than what the generic ballot change as a national shift could have predicted for Democrats in 2018. And that's because when you actually take a look, this is just a massive difference here, 241 versus 208, but it also isn't just that either. When you take a look at the shift map, yeah, the national numbers changed, but look at 2016 versus 2018, right? 344 districts swung to the left, right? Just 74 districts swung to the right. And of those, 116 Democratic districts swung by over 15 points to the left. An additional 158 shifted between 5 and 15 points to the left. These are massive and monumental shifts across a lot of these states, a lot of these districts, and that's exactly why the Democrats came close to victory in some of these districts and won by an exceptionally large amount in comparison to the 2016 cycle. So when we look at these generic ballot numbers, if Democrats do in fact replicate 2018, sure, the national numbers will predict that. But you could actually find Democrats on track to potentially win additional House seats if those numbers hold in 2026 beyond what the national shift might suggest. And I think that's why it is so damning to the Republicans that looking at this data roughly a year out, it doesn't show signs of improvement for a political party that has been naysaying on this idea that Democrats were gaining momentum across the country. Because you can find that in the data we've been seeing, right? You can find that in the most recent Quinnipiac University poll that shows us that Democrats are up by 9. Because when you take a look at some of the other data points that we've been seeing tracking from the very beginning, I mean, I want to go to the first poll that we saw right after Republicans, had gotten into the White House. Republicans led by 3. Then it was a tie. Then Republicans led by 1 with Signal, and then Democrats were up by 1, but it was a lot of back and forth, and it wasn't really anything super major or super substantive. Then Donald Trump's approval rating started to get negative, and only Republican firms could find Republicans ahead, and even now, they struggle to do exactly that. And as we find the average here upticking for the Democratic Party, and 2 high-quality pollsters saying the Democrats are up by 8 and 9 points respectively, is something that I think really tells the story of voters being discontent and disillusioned with the President of the United States, and now, finally, taking it out against the political party that he represents. So looking at 2026, I think we're pacing on track for a Democratic wave. I think that a lot of it will also depend on what we see happening here with redistricting as Republicans try to undergo new maps across the country. That will make a difference. Democrats will too. Maryland seems to be considering it. Illinois seems to be considering it over there. That matters a lot. Proposition 50, what happens in 2 days' time in Election Day in California, will also make a difference, right? A lot of these states will change. The House elections will be largely determined by what Democrats are able to do. This is really interesting. Utah having the TBD congressional map here. It looks like Ohio is going to have one of their own implemented as Democrats just accepted the recent deal here in this state. I want to see if they've actually fully updated it for Ohio in 2026. Let's see if they acknowledge it. Redistricting. Here we go. There we go. So that map is going to be implemented. Democrats are probably going to be able to hold on to damn near every single seat in that state of Ohio. So what we're finding is that on the case of redistricting, the Democrats are practically matching the Republican Party nationwide, making this really just a moot effort for not only Republicans, but arguably both parties as we start to see it level off, but also, too, something that still sets up a conducive enough election that Democrats could very reasonably win the House majority by quite a significant amount. I mean, you will find that if Democrats are, in fact, on track to win by 8 or 9 points nationally, it doesn't matter about redistricting. Obviously, the majorities and the amount that you have will make a difference if the VRA goes and new maps are drawn across the country. But as it presently stands, right, I would take that as the Democrats, would still be able to win the House majority. It would just be far slimmer. But let's say the VRA is not touched. Let's say that redistricting ceases in 2025, and that's pretty much all that we deal with on both sides of the aisle. Democrats will be set up quite well for 2026. And I think that that's what the data is telling us. That's what the numbers have been telling us for a while. And, I think it's something that makes a huge deal and huge difference for the midterms. So in 2 days, we will have the Tuesday elections. I'm going to be live streaming if you want to watch alongside with me. Probably will start at around 7:30 p.m. Eastern time as we start to get results trickling in. But very genuinely speaking, what we're taking a look at is what will those results tell us? Because the generic ballot is only a poll, right? The data here only stands to serve as where do voters a year out say, if I had the option of voting in next year's midterms, who am I going to vote for? Versus the elections on Tuesday, which are real elections, really tell us about where we are, really tell us about the data that we can unpack. What did the trend lines look like in Virginia? What do they look like in New Jersey? What do they look like in California? What do they look like in New York City? What is the reason why, either party might be doing better or worse in different regions of each state? So much to unpack. Real elections. That will give us the first real set of major races in the opposition to Donald Trump as president of the United States. And I think that we will either find that it will reaffirm the same findings that NBC News is telling us, this frustration, this anger, and disaffection with the Republican Party that is translating into Democratic Party dominance on the national level. Does that trickle down to a massive victory for Prop 50, a big victory for Mikey Sherrill, an even larger one for Abigail Spanberger, for Zohran Mamdani in New York City? What is it that we find? And maybe there won't be. That's something we'll have to wait and see. So a lot of data to unpack. I'm grateful for NBC News for releasing new data points like these because they really do sort of shake up the way we look at the races roughly 1 year in advance. And it looks like if you were to be in either political party on the side that's looking like it's going to win, you'd much rather be a Democrat than a Republican at this point when it comes down to the 26 midterms. And not much is going to change that between now and November of 2026 unless Republicans can really start ramping up their game. Right now, voters blame them for the shutdown. They blame Trump. They're upset with the economy and immigration and all of these different things that they feel as if the Republican Party is out of line with than the Democrats on the national level. The same things that foretold the defeat of the Democrats in the 2024 election, we're starting to see happen now. And in 2 days' time, we'll have some concrete results to either prove or disprove the theory that we have at hand. But as it stands today, NBC News, Quinnipiac, and others are clear. The Democrats are up nationwide because of this anger with Donald Trump. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 House election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.